There was a boy who believed he was made wrong. Not broken by something that happened, not damaged by someone else, just wrong, from the beginning, like a mistake the universe forgot to erase. His name was Danny, and at 16, he had perfected the art of becoming invisible. Not because he wanted to disappear, but because he believed that's what people wanted from him. To not be seen, to not be heard, to take up less space in a world that already felt too crowded for someone like him. Every morning started the same way. He'd stand in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at a face he didn't recognize as his own, searching for something he couldn't name. His reflection felt like a stranger wearing his skin. He'd practice smiling, trying to find an expression that didn't look rehearsed, that didn't feel like a performance. But every smile fell flat, every attempt at normalcy felt forced, and eventually he'd give up, settling for the blank expression that had become his default. The face of someone who had learned to feel nothing, because feeling everything was too much. School was a theater where everyone knew their lines except him. He'd watch other kids laugh at jokes he didn't understand, form connections that seemed to happen naturally, move through hallways with a confidence he couldn't imagine possessing. They made it look effortless, being human, being normal, being enough. And Danny would wonder what instruction manual he'd missed, what fundamental lesson in being alive had somehow skipped over him. He sat in classrooms but never raised his hand, afraid that his voice would reveal what he already knew, that there was something fundamentally different about him, something that made him less than everyone else. His parents noticed, of course. How could they not? The boy who used to fill their home with questions and laughter had become a ghost, present, but not really there. They tried everything. Conversations that felt like interrogations. Concerned looks that made him feel like a problem to be solved. Therapists with kind eyes and questions that seemed to dig for pain he couldn't articulate. Depression, they said. Anxiety. Labels that were supposed to explain him, but only made him feel more broken, more unfixable, more convinced that he was a puzzle with missing pieces that could never be found. At night, Danny would lie in bed and imagine a different version of himself. Someone confident, someone whole, someone who didn't feel like they were constantly drowning in a room full of people breathing normally. He'd think about ending it sometimes, not because he wanted to die, but because he wanted the noise in his head to stop. The constant loop of thoughts that told him he wasn't enough, that he'd always be too much and not enough at the same time, that the world would be better off without the weight of his existence in it. But he never did anything about those thoughts. Not because he was brave, but because he was too tired, too numb, too convinced that even his own ending would be something he'd mess up. Then came the Tuesday that changed everything. It didn't announce itself. There were no signs, no cosmic warnings that this would be the day the ground shifted beneath his feet. It started like every other day, with the same hollow routine, the same performance of being okay. But in fourth period, Mrs. Chen assigned a project, a simple thing. Write about a moment that defined you. Danny almost laughed. What moment? What definition? He was undefined, a blank space where a person should be. He went home that day with no intention of doing the assignment. But at 3 a.m, unable to sleep, he opened his notebook. And something strange happened. His hands started moving. Words poured out that he didn't know were inside him. He wrote about feeling broken, about the weight of existing in a body that felt wrong, in a mind that felt too loud, in a world that felt too bright and too dark at the same time. He wrote about the shame of not being able to explain what was wrong, because nothing was wrong and everything was wrong. He wrote for hours, and when he finally stopped, the sun was coming up, and he had filled 23 pages with words he'd never said out loud. He almost didn't turn it in. Almost threw it away, almost chose silence again. But something made him walk up to Mrs. Chen's desk and place those pages face down, unable to look at her, unable to speak. She nodded, said nothing, and Danny walked away certain he'd made a mistake, that he'd revealed too much, that she'd see what he'd always known, that he was too broken to fix, too damaged to help, too far gone to save. 3 days later, Mrs. Chen asked him to stay after class. Danny's stomach dropped. Here it comes, he thought. The concerned teacher talk, the guidance counselor referral, the proof that sharing was a mistake. But Mrs. Chen didn't look concerned. She looked like she was holding something precious. She handed him back his paper, and on the first page, in red ink, she'd written only one sentence. You're not broken, Danny. You're just experiencing being human at a volume most people can't hear. He read it again, and something inside him cracked open. Not broke, cracked. Like a seed that has to split apart before it can grow. You're experiencing being human at a volume most people can't hear. Not broken, not wrong, not less, just different. Just feeling things deeper, hearing things louder, experiencing life at an intensity that most people never touch. His sensitivity wasn't a flaw. His depth wasn't a defect. His pain wasn't proof of his inadequacy. It was proof that he was alive. Really alive. In a way that most people were too distracted to be. Danny started paying attention differently after that. He noticed that when his classmates laughed, it was often hollow, a social performance rather than genuine joy. He noticed that their confidence was often a mask, just like his blankness was. He noticed that the kids who seemed to have it all together were sometimes the ones crying in bathroom stalls, hiding their own volume, pretending to be quieter than they were. He wasn't the only one performing. He was just the only one who'd been honest about it. He started writing more, not for assignments but for himself. He wrote about the specific shade of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people, the particular ache of wanting to connect but not knowing how, the strange beauty of feeling too much in a world that tells you to feel less. And slowly, something shifted. The words that had been trapped inside him, eating him alive, found a way out. And in their release, he found something he hadn't expected. Purpose. He showed his writing to one person, then another. He started a blog, anonymous at first, then with his name attached. He wrote about depression, not as a clinical diagnosis, but as a lived experience. About anxiety, not as a disorder, but as a response to a world that often feels unsafe. About feeling broken, not as a truth, but as a lie we tell ourselves when we don't fit into boxes that were never meant to hold us. And people responded. Strangers from across the world who said, "Me too. I thought I was the only one. I thought I was alone." Danny learned something that no therapist had been able to teach him, that his brokenness wasn't a flaw, it was a gift, a terrible, painful, beautiful gift, because the cracks in him were where the light got in. The sensitivity that made him feel too much was the same sensitivity that let him understand others deeply. The pain that made him want to disappear was the same pain that connected him to every other human being who'd ever felt lost, alone, scared, or small. His wound was his wisdom. His struggle was his strength. His darkness was what taught him to recognize and create light. By the time Danny turned 18, he wasn't a different person. He still felt things deeply, still had days when the volume was too loud, when existence felt like too much weight to carry. But he'd learned to see those days differently, not as proof of his brokenness, but as evidence of his humanity. Not as a life sentence, but as a weather pattern that would pass. Not as who he was, but as what he was experiencing. There was a difference, a crucial difference. He never forgot Mrs. Chen's words. You're experiencing being human at a volume most people can't hear. He carried them like a talisman, a reminder that what he'd seen as weakness was actually a kind of superpower. The ability to feel deeply in a world that was growing increasingly numb. To see clearly in a culture that preferred comfortable blindness. To speak honestly in a society built on pretty lies. His volume wasn't a problem. It was his purpose. And the moment he stopped trying to turn it down, stopped apologizing for taking up space, stopped shrinking to make others comfortable, he discovered something radical. He discovered that he wasn't broken at all. He'd just been trying to be someone else's version of whole. And the moment he stopped trying to fix himself, he realized there was nothing to fix. Just a young man, learning to be exactly who he was meant to be, at exactly the volume he was meant to exist at, in a world that desperately needed people brave enough to feel things fully and speak about them honestly. That was the moment everything changed. The moment he realized that his supposed brokenness was actually his becoming. And that's when Danny finally came home to himself.